the categories we're going to use to describe it, which are very often drawn from the categories we already use to understand things in general. So this is going to be hard to understand without an example. So I'm going to take another hammer example because Heidegger likes hammers. He says a hammer that is heavy can be interpreted as this thing, a hammer, has a property of heaviness. So we've got this object with a predicate. We could understand the hammer that way, but this is a specific interpretation. The way, if we were going to put it into words, which in itself is a little bit of a tricky thing to do, the way we would actually first have understood this would be as too heavy, hand me another hammer. That's a direct quote from Heidegger. It's in our dealings with the world where we notice things aren't working right. It's how we would understand that the hammer is there. And we can then, so it's inside of our understanding. We have this hammer and we're using it for something that ultimately relates to our for the sake of which. We have some sort of, we can look at it and get a first understanding of what is wrong with it. And that's the foresight. That is the too heavy, hand me another hammer. That's, your attention has been focused on the hammer to the extent that you can say, too heavy, hand me another one. But the way you get to this thing, a hammer, has the property of heaviness, is by forcing it into a foreconception of the categories you're going to use. You know that the right way to talk about things is with an object and a predicate. And therefore, you talk about the hammer as an object with a predicate. And this is totally what Heidegger is doing too. What he thinks makes him special is that he attempts to let the objects tell him what categories they want to be understood under. He attempts to make his categories as close to the actual experience of the phenomena as possible. But it's still an interpretation because he still has categories that he's going to take the details of experience and force them into. And this is where we get discourse and language, which is interesting because we're nearly at the end of the first half of Being in Time, and he's just now introducing language. An understanding that we have, that I know how to ride a bike, that I know how to hammer something, can be put into an interpretation and specifically articulated in the sense of broken into parts. And then by using words which have their own sort of ready-to-hand tool-like properties, we can attempt to relay that interpretation to another Dasein. Specifically, by bringing back to mind understandings that Dasein has. Or rather, not so much specific, but because that other Dasein also has the structure of being able to understand things. Because that Dasein also can use tools. He can understand what you mean when you're talking about using a hammer. And so this is his understanding of language. That is something where a Dasein attempts to relay its understanding to another Dasein by means of these articulated words and interpretations. Okay, so I've gone through a lot of stuff. First, okay, I want to talk about interpretation a little bit more because it's one of, in my opinion, his most interesting ideas, and it's the one I bring up in theorem conversations the most often. So I want to dwell on this a little bit, and then we'll get to what I promised of taking some examples. So I'm going to use an example that the math people are probably going to kill me for, because I probably am going to miss something important in the technical details. But I feel like the idea will be comprehensible enough to be useful. So we're going to take the real number line starting at 0. What are we going to do with this thing? We want to tell somebody about it. We want to explain to someone what we mean when we say the real number line starting with 0. They haven't heard these words before, they don't know what we're talking about. But one way we could do it is we could say, it is x for every, where x is greater than or equal to 0. That'd be one way of doing it. Just like, okay, well, it's anything you can think of that's bigger than 0. That's the real number line greater than 0. Or we could say it's a union of sets that look like this. It's a union of integers going up and the open sets in between them. That would be another way of talking about it. It wouldn't, neither of these, and there are more. You could come up with crazy ones, I'm sure. I'm sure you could come up with one that took this entire board and was still a perfectly adequate understanding of what the real number line was. What we're doing here is we understand how to use the real number line. We understand that things can get bigger, but we can't go back past 0. We understand how to actually manipulate. It's a sort of abstract sort of manipulation, but it's a manipulation nonetheless. We know that as you go along this way, things get bigger. As you go along this way, things get smaller. We know they can't go past this. Like, we know how to deal with this object. So that's our forehatting. We have this already. And we've got our foresight. We look at it and say, well, okay, I look at this, and it tells me how it wants to be viewed. It wants to be viewed as in, having a definite beginning, but like having dots at the end. Like it just presents some things that are going to naturally arise in my interpretation. But finally, I choose the categories that I'm going to apply to it. In this, I used a particular style of mathematical writing in which I'm using variables and sets of variables satisfying a certain category. In this one, I'm using a totally different set of, well, not totally different, but a different set of categories, which I'm talking about unions of very specific sets, and I have parentheses denoting open sets, and I have commas denoting that there's more things going on. So these are both perfectly valid interpretations of the real number line, but they're both interpretations. They're both different ways of looking at it, and they're both but they are different. There's an important difference here. They are using different categories to talk about the same thing. Now, interpretations don't always have to be perfect. It's entirely possible to force something into an interpretation that it just simply doesn't fit. So if I say, I'm going to apply the category of integers, then I would say the real number line is 1, 2, 3. It's not, ... It's not a totally stupid interpretation. That's sort of like what the real number line is. And if my categories require it, that's how I'm going to present it. But it's missing something. It's missing a lot of some things. Specifically everything between 1 and 2, and 3 and 2 and 3, etc. So I used a mathematical example because it's really, really clear. But when you've got things that are more complicated, things involving Dasein, the interpretations are going to necessarily be more difficult. They're going to necessarily leave more out. They're less likely to be like this, and more likely to be like this. So, for instance, we get things like tools are objects with the property of usefulness, or something like that. That's an interpretation of the right hand. It's not a stupid interpretation of the right hand, because we can, in fact, look at hammers as being material objects, and we can, in fact, look at them as having the property of purposefulness. But it's motivated by the category of objects with predicates. And it leaves things out. It leaves important things out. So I've used the word interpretation in the term a lot. And this is what it means. It means an understanding of something that is useful insofar as it makes it definite. It allows you to talk about it. Heidegger is an interpretation too. There isn't, like, ready-to-handness. The word ready-to-hand has nothing to do with the ready-to-hand. And in fact, it's not entirely clear when something stops being ready-to-hand and becomes present-at-hand. The world as it actually exists is vaguer than even Heidegger. But nonetheless, it is necessary to have an interpretation to talk about it. And the way we evaluate an interpretation is by its usefulness, what we can do with it, and by how much of the phenomena it captures. So science is an interpretation of the natural world. It is an incredibly